The trauma bay doors blew open before the helicopters even touched the tarmac, and Nurse Sarah Kellerman felt the pressure in the air shift like a storm front rolling in off the ocean. She had worked 11 years in this hospital, had seen gunshot wounds and highway pileups and the aftermath of a warehouse fire that took 4 lives in one terrible afternoon. But she had never seen anything that made her chest tighten the way this did. Through the glass she watched 2 Black Hawks settle onto the helipad, rotors screaming, kicking up a storm of grit and paper cups from the parking lot below. Men in full combat gear poured out of the open bay doors before the wheels had even finished their final bounce, rifles slung tight across their chests, moving in a formation so practiced it looked choreographed. At the center of that formation, 4 of them carried a stretcher between them, running, boots pounding the concrete in perfect rhythm. Sarah didn't wait for someone to tell her what was happening. She grabbed her gloves, snapped them on, and was moving toward the ambulance bay doors before the charge nurse had even finished paging the trauma team overhead. Behind her she heard Dr. Marcus Whitfield's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, sharp and furious, demanding to know who had authorized a full tactical response to land on his hospital's helipad without so much as a phone call. Whitfield had built his career on order. 30 years as head of trauma surgery had taught him that chaos killed patients, that every unauthorized variable was a threat to the surgical outcomes he had spent his life protecting. And right now a squad of armed operators storming through his emergency department represented every nightmare scenario he had ever briefed his residents about. His face had gone the color of old brick, and his finger was already rising, already pointing toward the doors, already demanding an answer nobody in the room seemed to have. But Sarah wasn't looking at Whitfield. She was looking at the man on the stretcher, and something in her chest recognized him half a second before her conscious mind caught up. The tactical vest. The faded patch on the shoulder, a small American flag stitched crooked, the kind a person sews on themselves rather than a quartermaster. The dog tags tangled with a rosary. She had seen that exact configuration once before, 3 years ago, in a different trauma bay in a different state, when a Green Beret named Danny Reyes had come through her doors after a training accident, and she had held his hand through 2 surgeries and a coma scare that lasted 6 days. Danny had lived. Danny had written her a letter afterward that she still kept in a drawer at home, thanking her for talking to him even when the doctors said he couldn't hear her. And now, lying on this stretcher with blood soaking through camouflage fabric and his face slack and gray, was Danny's spotter, a soldier named Ellis Cho, a man Sarah had met exactly once, at Danny's wedding 18 months ago, when he'd shaken her hand and said, only half joking, that if he ever ended up in a hospital he hoped it was hers. Sarah didn't have time to explain any of that to Whitfield. Not with him bearing down on her. Not with the phone already pressed to her ear, and a voice on the other end identifying itself as a duty officer from a base 300 miles away. She held up one hand, a gesture that had shut down panicking family members and combative patients alike over the years. And it worked now too, buying her 3 seconds of silence. Into the phone she said the only thing that mattered. Patient status, vitals, mechanism of injury, ETA already 0 because he was here, already on her table. She didn't ask why a full SEAL security detail had escorted a wounded operator to a civilian trauma center instead of a military hospital. She didn't ask why Black Hawks had scrambled without notifying the hospital's own emergency coordination line. She would ask those questions later, if there was a later, if the man on the stretcher made it through the next hour. Right now his pressure was crashing. His pulse was thready and fast, and the tactical medic running alongside the stretcher was shouting numbers that made her stomach drop. He scrubbed in himself, pushed past 2 junior surgeons to take the lead on the chest, and worked with the kind of focused silent intensity that had made him legendary in this hospital long before tonight. Whatever anger had lived in him at the sight of those helicopters was gone now, burned away by the only thing that had ever mattered more to him than order. A patient he could still save. They found the source of the bleed 11 minutes in, a nicked vessel behind the 3rd rib that the field medic's pressure dressing had only partially controlled. Whitfield's hands moved with the precision of a man who trusted nothing but his own eyes and instincts, and Sarah watched the numbers on the monitor stop their terrifying slide and begin, slowly, to climb back toward something survivable. Somewhere outside the operating room she knew the SEAL team was still waiting, still standing in that lobby in full gear, And she found herself thinking about the promise she'd made to Danny Reyes's wife, and to Ellis Cho himself at that wedding, the easy joke about hoping to end up in her hospital someday. She hadn't known that night on the dance floor that the joke would come back to her with this much weight behind it. It took 2 hours to close him up, 2 hours during which Sarah barely left his side, monitoring the numbers that mattered and the ones that didn't, adjusting drips, calling for blood, doing the 1,000 small invisible things that never make it into the dramatic retelling of a night like this but are the actual difference between a patient who lives and one who doesn't. When Whitfield finally stepped back from the table, peeling off gloves stained dark, he looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. He told her quietly that in 30 years of trauma surgery, he had never once had a nurse identify a classified operator by a stitched-on patch and a set of dog tags faster than an entire intelligence apparatus could confirm his identity through official channels. He told her he'd been wrong to grab her arm. He told her, and this part surprised her more than anything else that night, that he was glad she hadn't waited for his permission before she started fighting for that man's life. Ellis Cho's condition stabilized fully by morning, his vitals climbing into ranges that made the ICU attending finally exhale for the first time in hours. Word had apparently traveled fast through whatever channels these things travel through, because by 6 a.m., the hospital's parking structure held not 2 Black Hawks but 4, and the SEAL team that had stormed the emergency doors the night before was standing in a loose formation just outside the main entrance when Sarah finally walked out to catch some air and a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold in her hand. She didn't understand at first why every one of them turned toward her at once. She didn't understand why the senior chief among them, a broad-shouldered man with gray at his temples and a face that looked like it had weathered every kind of storm the world could offer, stepped forward, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand in a slow formal salute. And then the others followed, one by one, boots together, a wall of camouflage and quiet gratitude standing at attention for a woman in wrinkled scrubs who hadn't slept in 20 hours and still had someone else's blood dried into the creases of her knuckles. Later, someone would tell her that in their world, a salute like that wasn't given lightly, that it was reserved for the kind of respect that couldn't be bought with rank or ceremony, only earned in the space of a single terrible night when everything was on the line and someone refused to let a life slip away. Sarah would think about that salute for years afterward, would keep the memory of it folded away next to Danny Reyes's letter in that same drawer at home. 2 reminders that the work she did in scrubs and gloves mattered in ways that reached far beyond the walls of any one hospital. Dr. Whitfield changed, too, in the weeks that followed, quicker to trust his staff's instincts, slower to let protocol overrule instinct in the moments that mattered most. And Ellis Cho, when he was finally strong enough to speak, asked for exactly one visitor before his family arrived. And it was her. And the first thing he said, in a voice still rough from the ventilator, was that he'd told her he'd end up in her hospital someday, hadn't he? And wasn't it something that he'd finally been right? If this story moved you, if you believe the people who run toward danger without waiting for permission deserve to be remembered, hit subscribe and join this channel for more true-to-life stories of courage, sacrifice, and the everyday heroes who show up when it matters most. There's another story waiting for you next week, and you won't want to miss it.